Welcome to the 127th episode. I do that every week, I realize, but that's because every week I'm stunned by the number of History Matters.
It's important.
It is very important, and so does coffee. Today, for reasons that do not need to be explained, we're going to be talking about monarchy and the United States. This is the benefit of my waiting until Thursday to figure out what I'm going to talk about, is that this became very apparent yesterday that this needed to be discussed. But before I plunge into that, I am going to turn to my partner in crime, Annie, who will explain the rules of the game.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Annie Evans from New American History, and delighted to be with you as we are every Friday. We have a lot to discuss this morning, but I do want to remind folks that the National Council for History Education currently has a call out for proposals for their conference, which is coming up in March. You can already register for that conference, and they are hosting later on this month a civics summit. Is that correct, Kathleen? Equity summit.
Yeah.
Civics summit. Equity summit. Okay. I'm thinking Constitution Day is coming up. The Equity Summit is September 24th, I believe. Proposals are due the 26th. Hopefully I got that all right. I'll be there. I hope many of you will be there, and we are very excited for you to visit ncheteach.org to find out all the information, how you can do all of those activities. But today, during the conversation, I'll be monitoring the chat like we always do, but if you have questions, and I know today you will have questions, those need to go in the Q&A. That is where we will look for them in about a half an hour when Joanne is done talking. So we will see you then.
And a reminder to keep everything family friendly.
Exactly.
Whatever you post, family program. Thank you, Annie, very much. Okay, and also a reminder for those who are coming along late here, if you want to join in the chat, be sure that it's set to everyone so that everyone can see what you're saying. And anyone who is here who is new, please let us know, because the wonderful History Matters community will welcome you. Okay, so it is not a surprise at all, the topic that I think we need to talk about today, and that is the relationship and the feelings of the United States towards the British monarchy and towards monarchy in general. It is kind of shocking that Queen Elizabeth died, in part because her stable presence has been an always thing for many, many people. And so I can imagine, regardless of your feelings about the monarchy or even about her absence must be shocking for a lot of people in England, and is a little weird to consider just a different monarch on the throne. Now, I have been, this will not be any surprise, following along on Twitter, as I do, the response to Queen Elizabeth's death yesterday. And it's fascinating because it's a whole spectrum of responses, which I think is as it should be. And there are some people, even Americans, who are shedding tears and really feel moved by this. There are some who are doing what one does on Twitter and cracking wise in a variety of different ways. There are people in England, people in Ireland, who have, in one way or another, a more personal response. There are people of color of various sorts who are registering their opinions on the empire and colonialism, all of which I think makes perfect sense to do right now, because yes, a woman died, and there have been people on social media saying she's someone's grandmother, she's someone's mother, and she's a person, but she also was a monarch of an empire. And it's an interesting example of the ways in which, particularly I think with monarchies, the monarch becomes not just a symbol of the nation, or a symbol in this case of the empire, but a kind of embodiment of it, so that it becomes really hard, if not impossible, to separate the person from the place. And I think we're getting in all kinds of responses. I'm sure, I haven't been watching TV yesterday, I haven't looked at it today, but I'm sure on every form of media possible, you will see a wide range of responses reflecting all kinds of different things, whether it's personal, whether it has to do with history, whether it has to do with deep history, whether it has to do with world stability. I mean, you can go on and on and on. I think all of these responses are perfectly apt. I don't think anyone should be silenced on what they're saying right now. People have a right to say what they want to say, even when a monarch dies. And this is part of what I want to talk about today, is the emotions bound up, even in the United States, with the British monarchy, with the royal family, how this goes all the way back, and how in some ways Americans are still bound up with at least the culture of the British monarchy, if not everything else about it, or at least some Americans are. I just think back to the wedding, any wedding, but Princess Diana's wedding, or any of those royal weddings, right? People getting together in groups. There were a group of people I knew here who got together and they were like, we're going to watch it together. And you know, it became an event, partly because of the pomp and circumstance, partly because there's some kind of, for some people, cultural hook that the royal family has in them for Americans, which goes all the way back. And that's what I want to address, really, is the complex feelings that Americans had towards the monarch and monarchy at the beginning of this nation, and how in some ways, some of that complexity really stuck around, evolved, reshaped itself over time, came and went. There are very few absolute constants in American history, but certainly, as I think we will see in the conversation today, there are a lot of ways in which things have held steady in the spectrum of ideas and thoughts that people have about the British monarchy. Now, one of the things that I think it's easy to forget or to not know is the degree to which British colonists in North America, and particularly the American colonies, the 13 original colonies, how colonists were absolutely and as bound up with their sense of loyalty to the king as any other British subject would be, maybe even more so because they were so far from the center, right? London was the center of all things political, cultural, social. If you were in the colonies, you felt a little bit remote, but certainly for a very long time, you had intense loyalty to the King of England. Yeah, that the king, in a sense, that isn't necessarily meant to be hokey, was the father, was a kind of figure that you had a personal sense of loyalty towards, or at least many people did. And you can see this best by looking at colonists in the lead up and early phases of the American Revolution, and watching the really gradual process by which colonists slowly backed themselves away from that sense of loyalty. It took a long time for that to break. What initially broke, what Americans initially were angry at and in a sense protesting against, was Parliament, was acts of Parliament. And it was Parliament who, in the minds of many colonists, were sort of evil ministers who were engaging in corruption or unfairness, and the colonies did not have representatives in Parliament, so there was no way they felt in which they could readily protest and absolutely be heard. And they, I mean, I suppose rightly, logically assumed that there was no reason why people in Parliament couldn't be unfair in taxes or legislation that they were passing on the colonies, because they had nothing wrapped up in it. They didn't have property. They could foist things off on the colonies, whether or not in reality at this point they were doing it. It certainly would be easy to do so. So Parliament is at the center of the revolutionary crisis. And when you look at the dynamics of the buildup to revolution, you see Americans of various kinds again and again and again reaching out to the king, prevailing upon the king to make things better, because they're still loyal to the king. The king represents everything that the British Empire in the minds of colonists, British colonists at the time, represented. There's an anecdote I often tell when I teach my American Revolution course that shows something of I don't even want to say adoration, the extreme degree to which many colonists felt that the king and the throne of England were almost hallowed ground. There's Benjamin Rush, Dr. Benjamin Rush, who ends up being really at the center of the American revolutionary effort. And he's, very educated man. He's a doctor, a physician to the founders in many ways. He goes to England at some point before the revolution, and he has a chance to see the throne of the King of England. And he says, in response to that he felt as though he were, quote, on sacred ground. I gazed for some time at the throne with emotions that I cannot describe, right? Benjamin Rush, educated man, sees the throne of the King of England and is overcome, is awestruck with all that it represents. It would be hard to exaggerate the degree to which colonists, like British subjects in other places as well, looked to the monarch, looked to the king as the essence of the British Empire and as their personal link, the person supposedly watching over them and their fate within the empire. So what you see in 1775 and particularly 1776 is the gradual backing away of colonists from the king, which is a slow process, a painful process. I didn't have time to look up these wonderful series of quotes that I gathered at some distant points in the past from John Adams that shows him very gradually backing away from the monarch step by step. Like, really, is this true? Could this be true? Maybe it is true, perhaps. And Adams, who is at the center ultimately of the independence effort, you can see him gradually letting go of that extreme sense of loyalty and pride, right? Colonists at this time are priding themselves on being part of the empire that has, this will be ironic in so many ways, the most liberty on the face of the earth, right? British liberty for some. Colonists prided themselves on that. Really, it's hard because when you think of the revolution, I realize we all think about the Declaration of Independence. We think about the fact that we think about war, we think about the colonies winning the war, and we don't often think about the emotion, the sentiment, the loyalty that was just commonplace beforehand, and the fact that that was deeply planted and people needed to break away from it. And this actually, in many ways, puts the Declaration of Independence in a deeper context. If you think about the language of the Declaration, the huge bulk of it is a series of he has done X, he has done Y. Think about the significance of that. What the Declaration of Independence represented was the final breaking away from the king. And we look at the preamble and focus on that because of all of the ways in which it touches on ideas about the rights of man. But the real meat of the Declaration at that moment was all of the he hases, was all of the sins and crimes that the colonists believed the king had committed against his own people, against the colonies. He has. Think about the drama of that if you're just getting to the point that you are now going to drop your loyalty to the king. This is the atmosphere in which Thomas Paine's Common Sense came out, January of 1776. He does several things in that pamphlet, and one of the things he does is just attack not only King George, but the whole idea of monarchy, the entire monarchical enterprise. I want to find here, I do have some quotes. I'm sure that most of you have read Common Sense. If you haven't, you should go read it. It was, as I'm sure many of you know, written not for an elite audience, but it was meant to be read by or read to colonists far and wide. It was deliberately meant to be popularly accessible. And Paine, January, early 1776, is striking at monarchy and the monarch in a way that probably many Americans had not seen before. For example, he totally dehumanizes King George III, writing, he has sunk himself beneath the rank of animals and contemptibly crawls through the world like a worm. Even brutes do not devour their young. And in this case, what he's referring to is the fact that, the king now appears to be turning on the colonists. Early in 1776, you get rumors that he was going to get Hessian soldiers to go to the colonies and enforce order. And ultimately, he declares the colonies in rebellion. Thomas Paine really comes out and talks about the monarch and monarchy in a way that probably most Americans had not heard before. Samuel Adams, who is not normally an understated person, in response to this says that common sense, quote, has fretted some folks here more than a little. It really made people think. It was very dramatic in the implications of what it was doing. The crown, in many ways, was the last remaining emotional and political connection, a personal way that colonists felt with their mother country. And Paine hits at that last link at that key point, 1776, when things are really beginning to unravel. There even was a recent petition, right? The colonists are trying to do everything that they can do to kind of hold it together. The olive branch petition, right? Please, we're sending an olive branch, and the king basically refuses to read it. So what the revolution, the early phases of the revolution really represent is Americans learning to step away from the monarch and monarchy and the King of England. Now, that doesn't mean that, poof, Americans were off the monarchy trail. That was their past. That was their history. That was what they knew culturally and in every other way, right? They had been raised to believe that that was the pinnacle of civilization and culture, all that the British monarchy represented. So even though the colonists ultimately declare independence, they break away, they are denouncing ultimately King George. And I should add, if you haven't read this wonderful book by Pauline Maier, American Scripture, there's a chapter in there called The Other Declarations, very much worth reading, in which she talks about the declarations of independence being written locally around the colonies. There wasn't just one declaration. People took that decision very seriously and got together in towns and debated the issue of independence, and then wrote their own declarations of independence. And in many of those declarations, again, what you see is people stepping away from the king, that last emotional and political link with everything that they'd known before. So the revolution, the colonies win the revolution, they need to start a new nation. All that they know is monarchy. And I've talked many times before about the ways in which Americans, post-revolutionary Americans, knew what they didn't want. I'm not really sure what they did. So they could say, and often did, monarchy is not good. We don't want monarchy, and we don't want pomp and circumstance, and we don't want aristocracy, and we don't want all the corruption, royal corruption of a royal court, blah, 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 blah. What they did want, they were far less clear about. What it means to be a republic, which is a democratic form of government, I will say. And I always say that when I use the word republic, because of all of the people who like to say we're a republic, not a democracy. A republic is a democratic form of government. So that statement ultimately doesn't really make sense. But at any rate, a republic is an experimental form of government. And the former colonists, now Americans, aren't entirely sure what they're doing. And when a question comes up, many people are very quick to point back and say, well, here's what we did before. Maybe we should do that again. And George Washington, who, in some ways already is father of his country at the launching of the country because of his role during the revolution, it's easy to see how he can sort of segue into being a different kind of king. So there's lots of, on the one hand, suspicion that some Americans want another monarch. There are some Americans who actually feel that there's going to have to be something pretty close to a monarch for the American experiment to survive. Famously, Alexander Hamilton is at the center of this. And in part, I have a quote here. Let me get it here. I pleasantly didn't number these pages. There we go. So in part, Hamilton throughout his political life made it very clear that he praised the British monarchy, basically called it the best government on the face of the earth, and felt very strongly and showed it in his policies and his political commentary that the American executive, the president of the United States, should be as close to a monarch as one could get. He did not have faith that a republic would survive. He actually says in actually the year before he dies, he's asked, right? So let me back up for a moment here. So at the Constitutional Convention, at the Federal Convention, on June 18th, 1787, he very famously gives, for those of you who know the Hamilton musical, the 6-hour speech in which he lays out his plan of government. And he suggests a national executive who serves for life during good behavior, so he can be impeached. And to Hamilton, the fact that he is elected and can be impeached means he is not a traditional monarch. So these are his words as transcribed by someone when he was giving that speech. Let me observe that an executive is less dangerous to the liberties of the people when in office during life than for 7 years. It may be said this constitutes an elective monarchy, but by making the executive subject to impeachment, the term monarchy cannot apply. And this did not fly. His idea did not fly. Nothing was acted on, but he basically stays true to that idea. He says, this is where I was headed a moment ago, a year before he dies, someone is trying to be his first main biographer and asks him questions. And one of the questions is essentially, he doesn't put it this way, but are you a monarchist? Like, did you really at the Constitutional Convention suggest that we have a monarch? And Hamilton says, no, it's going to be elected and life during good behavior, and that's not a monarch. And blah, blah, blah. He gets also very upset because he says that he believed, let me get the quote here because it's very funny. He's his whole life after that 1787 June speech, he's accused of being a monarchist forever because of his politics. So that's 1787. 1803 is when he's writing this letter, when someone's saying, tell us about your views about monarchy. And he says, you can hear the frustration. In the course of the discussions in the convention, neither the propositions thrown out for debate nor even those voted in the earlier stages of deliberation were considered as evidences of a definitive opinion in the proposer or voter. It appeared to me to be in some sort understood that with a view to free investigation, experimental propositions might be made, which were to be received merely as suggestions for consideration. So here, decades after he said it, Hamilton was like, we were supposed to be able to speak freely and just toss around ideas. And that's what I did. And I've never lived it down. And then goes on to say that he believed that the Republican theory, quote unquote, should have a fair and full trial in the United States, that to such a trial, it was essential that the government should be so constructed and as to give it all the energy and stability reconcilable with the principles of that theory. These were the genuine sentiments of my heart. So what he says is, without saying the second half of this, the first half of what he's saying there is, I understand Americans wanted this to be a republic. They wanted small r, Republican theory, not monarchy, to be holding sway. They wanted this to be a different kind of government. I get that. I get it. I understood that. That's what I did, although I pushed things to be as far towards something stronger as I could, but I didn't go beyond what I thought was small r Republican. That's his explanation for his politics, and I've talked about this. I don't know if I talked about it here, but certainly in lectures, about how he never really fully had faith that the American experiment would succeed. And in part, it was because it wasn't a monarchy. It didn't have that strong centrality at its center. At any rate, my larger point here is that you can see the emotion, the personal connection that people had at this point to the monarchy. You can see the ways in which they were bound. They had a sense that what was going on in London, and even more broadly at this period in England, was the center of all things cultural and political. that they, the same fascination that many Americans have now with anything royal family-ish. It's not identical, but it's the same kind of bond that whatever's going on there is big and special in some way and above normal politics, which is kind of what a monarch is supposed to be, right? So Americans still have a tangled, complicated relationship with monarchy and with the British monarch in particular. There's also, of course, a long history of America's special relationship with the British as far as foreign affairs go, as far as diplomacy is concerned. That's not necessarily linked with the monarch. But what I find fascinating about this moment is just the many ways in which you can still see the weird bundle of feelings and assumptions and some vague amount, excuse me, of discomfort by some and a great deal amount of discomfort on the part of others, all bound together in the way that people are responding to the death of Queen Elizabeth. Her death is sort of a, what do I want to call it? A moment in which people are sort of checking off what they think about the world, a certain kind of world, and what they might want that world to be like. It's one of those moments where there's a spotlight cast on something that happened, and the thing that happened is causing everyone to come out and discuss what they think about something that normally they don't necessarily hold forth on. And now we're going to be seeing a lot of that for a while on what the monarchy means, on what the British monarchy means, on what the Queen symbolizes, on what good she did the country, on what bad she did the country, on what bad she did the world, and the ways in which the United States still is bound up with that aspect of British government. I found online and could not verify the numbers. And I thought about it. I'll mention it, even though I don't have the specific numbers, but because it's interesting along these lines. There was a poll, I want to say that it was a CNN poll taken maybe 10 years ago. And there was a small number, but still a noticeable number of Americans who thought having a monarchy would be just fine, right? They were like, okay, like that'll be okay. And I paused at that when I was researching this morning, because that strikes me as the same kind of sentiment that I point to again and again and again now, this year and in past years, that it represents a lack of understanding about what democratic governance is. The modern monarchy is not the same thing as the monarchy in, the early modern world, for sure. But I think that in so many ways, if Americans of all kinds really understood what democracy offered, even if we haven't lived up to it yet, what it represents and what it could bring if we are attuned to the moment and work for it, and if they understood what they would lose without it, they would be thinking in a slightly different way about what's going on now. I'll end with this Payne quote because it says this quite well, if I can find it. Here it is, from Common Sense. He says, as in absolute governments, the king is law, so in free countries, the law ought to be king. And there is a major difference between a monarchy or an authoritarian government where the ruler is the law, and a country with a more democratic country where the law is king. Huge difference. What that means, I think, needs to be untangled for people. I've been trying to, I see now people are starting with mug. I've been trying to write about that. It's hard because my emotions are actually very much bound up with it. But I think our feelings about what's going on now, the monarchy, are going to be interesting to think about in light of what we talk about so often, which is how we feel about democracy and how we're behaving towards democracy, and what that suggests about America's bonds with democracy at the current moment, and the world having a sort of crisis of democracy at the moment. This is a very interesting moment to be talking about and thinking about monarchy. And so I mention that only because I think it'll be interesting to look through that lens as we're watching what unfolds in public commentary in coming days. Okay, so now you're going to have to travel with me with my mug choice. I had a mug which I was going to pick, which was in a sense a more conventional choice, and I've used it before. It is Shakespeare. It has to do with Shakespeare, right? And I was like, okay, right, Shakespeare. Oh, Annie's all happy, and I didn't pick that one, but you will see why I didn't pick that one.
Oh, okay.
I was gunning for it. I was going for it. I saw it, and it's really big.
Okay.
It's a fine mug, but
Next time.
that yeah, there will be another occasion, I am sure. Shakespeare discusses everything.
Yes.
But and for anyone here who is new, the explanation of this is that every week for 127 weeks, I have a mug that relates to what we discuss. I do not have 127 mugs, but in one way or another, I hit on the theme. So today's mug, in a sense, is totally not related to what we're talking about, except he is kind of the king of my home.
He is the king of Friday mornings, y'all.
Newbie is kind of royalty in my apartment.
Great.
And so I kind of thought in honor of Newbie, the bird monarch, and in honor of the fact that this is the day when I got him 2 years ago, this somehow seemed like I needed
Very
to
appropriate.
honor Newbie with this mug that
Wow, that is a beautiful mug.
And the person who gave me this mug,
Do we know
Carolee?
Carolee's got a spreadsheet.
Indeed, what was Carolee, I believe, made the Newbie.
Oh, she probably did.
Yeah,
she made this one for sure. I've got
well, yes,
4 or 5 that she's made over the last couple of years.
And the first thing here, Newbie's historic moments, getting saved from the dog chasing me in Central Park.
Oh,
so that was 2 years ago. At any rate, that is my reason for the
I love that. Perfect choice. I put earlier in the chat that Jonathan Groff would always be my favorite king. Now I think he's going to have to be my second favorite because Newbie's the king. Then
that was pretty brilliantly done, though, in Hamilton. I will say the role of the king and the fact that the music he's singing is a style that's several decades old.
Yeah,
pretty brilliantly done.
He's just sunshine in anything he does. But anyway, all right, we've got lots of great questions. You ready to dig in?
We are ready.
I've taken so many notes. Okay, Mike Klapka. Oh, Mike, I think this might be your first question that I recall. Mike asked, despite the outpouring of sympathy with Elizabeth's passing, what is the future of the monarchy in the UK in terms of it's so expensive to have a monarchy?
Well, so this is something I was thinking about this morning, not necessarily for purposes of our conversation here, but in a sense, the monarchy has been coasting along because of the fact that there's been this one monarch in place for so long, and she represented, whatever you thought of that stability in some sense. We've seen in semi-recent years the many ways in which the British monarchy is really not a modern institution, that it's wildly expensive, that there are a good number of people in England, in Great Britain, who believe that it kind of is an institution past its prime and that maybe it should be changed or eliminated or something. So what I think is interesting about this moment, and we also, there's a new prime minister as well, it's a real transition moment in a lot of ways, but particularly the fact, not the simple fact that there is a new king, but the fact that this person who's been in place and in a sense in her person has been preserving monarchy because people wouldn't act against it while she was there. This will be interesting to see what happens. I don't know. I can't predict that future, but I would assume that there will be more pushing against monarchy as an institution among some people. I just don't know if that'll amount to anything or not. And now will be not the time to judge that because people are still focused on Elizabeth and an incoming king. And so people are probably not going to step forward in as radical a manner as they might when everything, emotions settle down and people start to think about how things are going to proceed. But I said on Twitter yesterday, every now and again, there's a moment when the past seems very present in the present, and it like collapses time in an interesting way. And I thought of, and I wrote this when the Queen had not yet died, but the whole world was like, is she still alive? Is she still alive? And the idea that the world, including the United States and lots of Americans on social media, we're so focused on the status and the health of the queen. It just
All
struck me
day.
as all day
And
It
all
struck
night.
me as so 17th century, 18th century, as a moment that could have been without social media, but still the emotion of that was something so distant in a way, and yet so immediate. It really drove home for me the ways in which this is an ancient institution, and people are still emotionally bound to it in ways that they might not even be aware of until now and the coming days when they're forced to kind of reckon with it. This will be, speaking as a historian, this will be a really interesting moment to take a step back and see what people are saying and how they're saying it and what it represents. Because at a moment of dramatic change like this, if I were 50 years in the future and I wanted to understand what people felt about their country, their government, and democracy, this would be the moment. I would go to the Library of Congress or somewhere, right? I would go to the British Library and I would say, okay, I am going to look to see on this bunch of days right now, yesterday and the next couple days, and I would just read people's papers and look at newspapers to see the language and the logic that people were using in discussing this, and the spectrum of opinions, and what they seemed upset about, which some of which probably 50 years from now will not make any sense, and some of the things they weren't upset about, which in 50 years I might expect them to be. This would be the kind of moment that I would go to kind of dive in and get an opening sense of the culture and thoughts of this moment. So think like historians. I think it'll be really interesting to see how this evolves in the coming days.
All right, we've got lots of questions. Dale submitted a couple. Here's one. Can you think of any interesting examples of colonists who experienced grief at losing that unique relationship with the king after the revolution, and how did those colonists express it?
Well, I mean, there certainly were loyalists who, and that word is, they were loyal to the king, right? There were a good number of them. Some of them actually went to England, could not survive in what became the United States and went to England. And many of them were they were a little embittered, right? They gave up their lives and moved to England, and as much as they might have revered whatever was going on there, they were colonists and not, people who came from the center of empire. Many people went to Canada. So some loyalists fled, and in some cases, they were embittered. They felt that they couldn't stay, and they couldn't stay in part because by the time you get to the end of the revolution, it's not just a matter of breaking away from the monarch. It's the fact that the monarch has been killing American colonists in one way or another for years. So there's animosity, rightly so, on the part of the colonists. But I think, it was difficult for many loyalists, and there were a lot of lawsuits, right? Some loyalists came forward and said, well, the American army took my property and did X and Y, and I want it back, and I want to be compensated. And there was a lot of reckoning with what that meant. So it was there. I'm going to say poof, really early. There was not a poof, the revolution is over and everything is okay kind of moment. There was a large group of people who were not on the winning side, and yet were Americans, colonists before this, subjects before this, now citizens potentially, who had to, both on all sides, people had to reckon with what that meant. There's a book that I always say to people, I'm a historian because I'm bad with names and dates, and this is also true of book titles. There's a book that came out semi-recently about loyalists fleeing to Canada. Does anyone know the name of it?
And we'll have it, I bet, in 30 seconds.
I was going to say, you guys are so good that I know. Liberty's Exiles.
There you go, Keith.
Thank
Keith
you,
the
Keith.
win.
That is it, Liberty's Exiles. So if you're curious to get more on the very brief comments that I made there, Liberty's Exiles is actually a really interesting book, and takes a really personal approach to how people felt about that moment. Yes, that's actually, Carolee, that's true. If you tell me that the book is a document, I'll remember forever. I had never thought of that. That's a really good logic.
Yep.
You'd have to experiment with that.
That's right. That's so funny. All right, our friend Dave asks, how has the role of monarchy in Britain changed in terms of political influence over these past 70 years under the Queen? What role should the British monarch have politically moving forward?
That's a hard question, and I don't feel like I should be propounding on shoulds for England at this moment. But someone just, let me find it here. They made a comment, Reese actually, about monarchical structures versus things that are there for show. That's also an interesting question, right? Because I mean, even the president of the United States is a political position with specific duties outlined in the Constitution, and is a political center of our government, and has some ceremonial roles that he, or ideally, hopefully someday she, has to perform as well. That's performative. That's even more true when you're talking about the King or Queen of England, because they, because of the nature of monarchy, they kind of represent not just the empire, but also the pomp and circumstances is kind of a statement of wealth and well-being, you know, in their person, and in that kind of performative behavior. That the horses with the carriages, boy, are we going to see some of this in coming days, off the charts. All of that stuff is meant to be a statement about the monarch, the monarchy, and the country. So there is a lot about it that's performative. I'm sure that's going to get bound up in conversations that we're going to be having, we're seeing, about what should happen with the British monarchy. Because even though some of those things are performative, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're not important, right? Performative aspects of government can be ways of shaping culture and ideas and ideals, for better and worse. So I don't think you can say dismiss all the performative components, because they serve a purpose. The question is, what purpose should they be serving? That purpose, and how should things, if they should be adapted to come? You know, that, I mean, it's I don't have a personal connection with the Queen or the British monarchy, but it's an interesting thing to think about King Charles, which is just weird, right? Queen Elizabeth is forever. So suddenly it's like, okay, now just saying that is a little weird. I can't imagine. It's just got to be, even for that reason alone, that forever and forever and forever it's been Queen Elizabeth, and now it's going to be a new king. Again, weird and pre-modern and modern all at the same time.
It will be different for sure. All right, our friend Cece asks, she says, after the split with Britain, people of Boston removed all the royal symbols like lions and unicorns from the old State House and Custom House in Boston. Then she said in the 1960s, they restored the building to its 1712 appearance. At what point do you think acceptance of the past shifted? Did it have anything to do with War of 1812? You know, this going back to something that had been removed before.
Well, Americans, so the War of 1812, even though, you know, it's not the world's most decisive war, right? It's like, it's a war, and the main thing that happened is the United States didn't die at the hands of Britain, right? We survived. In a way, the impact of the War of 1812, more than anything else, was cultural or intellectual, because when you look at the culture of that moment, for example, when you look at political cartoons that came out around that time, there's a kind of cockiness in which the Americans are like, hey, we survived another war. You know, and even though in the end there was not an enormous amount that transformed as a result of that war, and plus our capital didn't survive very well, but Americans, you could argue, took another step away from England, because the fact that they beat England, that they, or survived another war with England, not that many decades after the first war with England, made Americans feel that, you know, maybe the United States was going to stick around for a while, and maybe, you know, England wasn't so great after all. So there was emotion towards England bound up in that moment. And I think a certain amount of people taking a step back, as you would if you're fighting a war against someone and they're burning down your Capitol or the White House. Yeah, you're going to take a step back and say, you know, look at us, we're better than you. And I think that's part of what happened during and after the War of 1812.
So Greg asks, what did the proposed Titles of Nobility Amendment reveal about the US and its relationship with the aristocracy?
You mean on decisions about what to call the President of the United States? I'll talk about that. And if that's not
Titles of Nobility Amendment, I'm literally not familiar with that, so I'm gonna have to look that one up, or Tim's gonna have to put a link for me in the chat.
Right. Let me talk about the decision on what to call the president, which relates to this.
Okay.
But it does basically, in one way or another, if you're talking about, excuse me, titles of nobility, you're talking about aristocracy. And in early America, there's an assumption. The assumption always was, if America, the United States, is just going to slip right back to where it was, right? The default is monarchy for the United States. They may have broken away from a monarchy, but that's all that anyone has ever known. So if we don't try really hard and pay attention to where we are, we're going to slip right back into where we were, and we're going to be a monarchy again. So they're very worried about aristocracy. They're very worried about things that to them felt like they were laying the groundwork for a new monarchy of some kind coming into view. The Society of the Cincinnati, which was an organization for officers who fought in the American Revolution, there was a hereditary component to it that basically freaked a lot of people out, because it suggested that we were creating a new aristocracy, and these officers and then their sons would go on to become the new aristocracy. They were very focused on the taint that noble titles would bring, not just to American culture, but to the ways in which it would warp and corrupt American government. You know, the interesting thing, one of the things I always find really interesting about studying the early decade or so of the new American Republic is the degree to which people assumed that how political leaders dressed, very lacy costumes or not, what kind of finery they owned, did they have really over-the-top carriages, how did they treat each other, how did they behave towards people in the street, that all of these seemingly minor things could warp, again, the country into going back towards monarchy, because the American people, seeing people in power behaving that way, would adopt that themselves. So the contagion of monarchy that existed at the time, the fear of that kind of contagion was pretty intense. What I referenced a moment ago about the title for the president, I'll just condense that, but it shows a lot of what I'm talking about in real time. If you want to see that actual debate, find the diary of William Mcclay, who's a Pennsylvania senator in the first Congress, and it's online, so it's not hard to get. And he records that debate about, okay, there's a national executive, and what do we call him? And John Adams is vice president presiding over the Senate, you know, coming up with titles like His Elective Majesty, right? He's trying so hard to like combine something of monarchy, but something Republican too, and we'll find a way to do that. And people again and again and again are sort of trying to figure out that compromise of what the president should be called. And when someone says finally President of the United States, John Adams goes ballistic and says, President of the United States? They're presidents of cricket clubs. Like, what we say that? He says, what will the soldiers and sailors the world over think of us? President of the United States? They will despise us to all eternity, which is a close to exact quote. So that too, it sort of touches on the same idea that figuring out what a non-monarch is and being able to escape the contagion of monarchy was a big part of what the early part of the early republic was grappling with. Oh, I can't hear you, Annie.
Sorry, I had muted myself because I thought I was going to cough.
I was like, I don't know the question.
So we have someone in the Q&A. It says anonymous attendee. Now I'm intrigued. I didn't think we put anonymous people in here. But anyway, they have a good question. Why did the British monarchy become so popular with Americans again? Like, what is our fascination?
Well, that I kind of think that in some ways it didn't go away. You know, I mean, I think if you look back and back and back and back, there's always a fascination. And I think in a way, it relates to some of the things that I've been talking about. It relates to the idea that it's an unabashed, aristocratic, over the top, pomp and circumstance kind of, not government, but practice, culture. And we don't really have something like that. You know, and you could say we have like families like the Bushes and the Kennedys, that there seems to be a sort of generational component, but not in the sort of unabashed, over the top, royal, monarchical grandeur kind of a way. So I think for some people, there's almost a fantasy component. I mean, think of Disney and all the princesses, man. You know, there's a fascination with the culture of royalty and the pomp and circumstance, which is pretty and, you know, really like nothing in real life in a whole variety of ways. I just think there's that kind of cultural bond that is largely devoid of actual content, but has to do with an emotional connection with what the display of it and the grandeur of it and the ways in which it does something that Americans don't do. I don't think that ever really left. You know, I have not gone and looked over the centuries of American history to see the ebbing and flowing of views towards the British monarchy. I'm sure there is ebbing and flowing. As a historian, I would never say there's a straight shot of anything. But I think there's always been some kind of fascination with it. And it's partly because it's foreign, and yet we understand it because it's part of us as well. Yeah, the romance of it is part of it too. Oh, there we go. The special relationship really dates to the 1890s. Yeah, that's a different thing than the views about the monarchy, since that's really more, it's all the jewelry, says Miriam. The special relationship is not specifically what I'm talking about, but absolutely, that should be seen as a kind of thing apart.
And when you mentioned the Disney princesses, there's been a lot of discussion about that. And, you know, they've really changed their brand on that in the last few years because they've gotten so much pushback. And I was thinking about like Diana and now Meghan Markle. Someone put in the chat that they felt like Meghan Markle really made America kind of fall in love with the monarchy again. So it'll just be interesting.
Made them fall in love with monarchy, but maybe I would say in a more complex manner, see monarchy again, right? So
relatable.
Right. So on the one hand, it's like an American actress who went on and, you know, is part of the royal family. On the other hand, how has she been treated by anybody, right? And so that falls into the category of what I'm talking about, of the sorts of things to think about in coming days. That here we are in this moment with awareness of things in this moment and thinking profoundly about things in this moment that maybe we haven't thought profoundly about as a nation, as we should have in the semi-recent past. And the monarchy ends up being a kind of way in which you are almost compelled to think about things. In this case, the simple question of who is in or out of the monarchy and how does race, you know, Meghan Markle, it would seem to me that there should be some really interesting pieces written in coming days about race and the monarchy and what people now are thinking about that connection and what the history of that has been over time. It's right in front of us, not just in the United States, but it's where we are, right? It is certainly in the United States, reckoning with what are we going to actually recognize about the nature of race relations in the United States? Are we going to actually stand up and acknowledge where we are and what its long history is? Are we going to actually confront it and think about it and work to make things better? Or are we going to, as some people are trying to do, sweep things under the rug and happily march ahead? I'm actually obviously on the side of not sweeping things under the rug, but we're at a moment where, you know, this is nothing new or surprising at all to say, but race is at the center of so many conversations right now, and that's true of democracy, and that's true now we're going to see it of monarchy. So it's another opportunity to have a conversation of a sort that we need to be having in modern times, particularly in the United States, but not only in the United States.
Yeah. All right, this one comes from Becky. Do you think the contemporary interest in having a monarchy is because younger folks who would have answered that survey probably don't understand the difference between monarchy in the 1700s and modern era?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think probably to a surprising degree, and I say this with a complete lack of data, but I think to a surprising degree, in the same way that I say over and over and over again, people don't understand what democracy is. They don't know what they lose when they lose democracy. It's a shocking thing to say, right? Because it's one of those banner words that as Americans, we you know, generally speaking, this doesn't hold true for the we're a republic, not a democracy people. That's a separate conversation. But democracy, liberty, freedom, those are the sort of parade and banner words that we wave around as Americans. That's what we stand for. And the fact that for many people, they have no definition, and that even as they're saying democracy is great, freedom, liberty, America, they're supporting things that are extremely anti-democratic. People, people don't not understanding democracy, they for sure don't understand what a monarchy is and how they evolve over time, and how a modern monarchy is different from an ancient or even early modern, pre-modern monarchy. You know, it's the same kind of thought process that goes with people looking at Republicans in 1855 and saying, yes, today's Republican Party is the party of Lincoln. Well, the name is the same, but it's not a straight line, right? Things evolve and change and can flip from one thing to the absolute opposite. And it's easy to not see that because it's easier to hang on to what you believe to be continuity. And that, I think that's true with a lot of things, but probably for many people, again, as we're going to be seeing, that's true of monarchy. I'm totally intrigued. Like I'm going to be. This is why I'm encouraging you all to watch with historian eyes what the public conversation is like, and what commentators are saying, and what people are getting upset by, and what people are particularly fascinated by, and what they're not commenting on that you think, why are they not commenting on this? And what kind of images are being tossed around, and who's doing the tossing and commenting? It will really be an interesting moment to think like a historian and try and get a sense of what this moment is revealing about how people feel about democracy, monarchy, government, race. All of these things are going to be smack in the middle of the public dialogue in a really interesting, topical, and potentially important way.
Well, I'm not sure if this is a question or a comment from Gloria, but she says, has it always been dangerous when a government loses its unifying or central focus of stability and tradition?
I mean, I can't say it has always been dangerous. I would say that if someone has been in power for decades and decades and decades and decades, to the point that people don't have to think about or evaluate certain things because you just assume things are going ahead, and you take for granted that the person who has power, in this case Queen Elizabeth, you kind of know who she is, you know what rules she upholds, you know that she's not doing radical things that, you know, are overturning the government in some way, right? So she represents some form of stability. Any change of a national leader, there's going to be a moment of vulnerability and fragility, because you then have to see what this new person, how they're going to behave, and are they going to uphold the rule of law and things like that, and the Constitution. Moments of dramatic change can be moments of extreme tension because of all that you don't know. And so I'm not necessarily predicting chaos in England, but it's some things will be different beyond the fact that we now say king and not queen of England. And we don't necessarily know what those will be. And it will partly have to do with today's public reckoning with what the monarchy is now and what they might want it to be. It'll be, again, I keep saying this, but I'm truly like, I want to see how the conversation plays out. It'll be interesting
Yeah, Francesca made a comment in the chat about all these concerts and sporting events being canceled, and some people are upset about that. So we're already starting to see that tension. It'll be interesting.
And the companies, the weird corporations, companies, stores that are like, Nabisco cookies, mourns with the royal family. It's sort of like.
And next week they'll have a commemorative tin for sale, and they'll make a lot of money off it.
Oh, right. That's a whole other component of what's going on here, which is also a little bonkers.
Merchandising. It's kind of
merchandising the death.
Yeah.
That's already begun.
I mean, look at Diana. That just turned my stomach. I remember.
Yeah. No.
All right, we got a couple more questions, but it's 3 after 11.
No, let's do one more question.
Okay, this comes from our friend David Malcolm. Says a lot of people who call themselves royalists tend to be more attached to the person, Queen Elizabeth II, than the royal family, and that as a whole, it might worry the monarchists. What with the ascension, can't say that word, ascension of the king, do you think people will drift away from the royalist sentiments permanently? Like, will this be it? Or will younger faces like Prince William and Harry kind of keep them engaged?
Wow. That is a really good question. I do not know the answer to that, but it's a very good and logical thing to ask.
Yeah.
If people have been mostly feeling loyal to the queen, this queen, when she goes away, what does it mean? And it's not like Charles has been like
a choir boy.
Public opinion, right? Charles is not Mr. Cozy with the public. So I don't know what it means, but if indeed that's the case, and it certainly feels logical that would be the case, that some people were really focused on her and maybe didn't interrogate that, but that was their main connection to the monarchy. Again, it gets back to what I just said. This is an interesting transition moment in which some thoughts and feelings are going to be exposed that maybe people hadn't thought about or revealed before.
Yeah, there's 2 really good questions left. I hate when we leave good questions on the table.
Okay, so let's do them. I'll be fast. I'll be really fast.
Okay, Dale says, considering the range of norms associated with British monarchy, how did those norms impact the development of American presidential norms in the early republic?
Well, they did, but not in a consistent way. So there was a lot of talk when you had people, even just in the first year or two of the government under the Constitution, trying to figure out how things should work with the president. They would inevitably point towards the king, and some people would say that's the way we should do it, and some people would say that's the way we explicitly should not do it. So I think John Adams refers to Washington's maybe it's his inaugural address as his most excellent speech, or he uses language that would have been used for a speech from a monarch, and people in the Senate are like, you can't use those words about a president, right? You shouldn't use those words about a president. And they would have been what he would have said about that kind of speech. Or people trying to decide. This is also Mcclay's diary, which I highly recommend going through because he's a character. And some of the things he includes in there, including this 2 or 3 pages where he describes the Senate trying to figure out if senators should be standing or sitting when the president enters the room, is directly on target with what we're talking about here, where people say, well, in England, the Commons stands when the Queen or when the King enters the room, and the Lords sit, and the Senate is like, oh, interesting. So maybe our representatives should stand and the senators should sit. And then someone says, yeah, well, the Commons don't have chairs because they're in the House of Lords. That's the only reason I'm standing. So anyway, there's a lot of very direct comparison. And it's complicated.
Yeah.
It's easy to say, I don't want that. And not so easy to say, okay, then what do we want?
Yeah. And the last one, Miranda's just making the point, is a lot of people have a beef with the British Empire for many reasons, but she's asking, isn't it more Parliament than the actual Queen? So her example was Queen Victoria, them keeping the Irish famine and genocide from her for so long. So is that anger misdirected? Should it be more directed towards Parliament?
I think it depends on the issue. And in our case, I mean, Queen Elizabeth's been there forever, but it is a good point that in the Queen or the King, the monarch, becomes seemingly the symbolic and emotional and seemingly political center. But indeed, as we started out by talking about Americans and the Revolution, Americans started out focusing on Parliament and policy. like, that's what's wrong here. It's parliament and policy. And they sort of made their way to the king. It's a good question. And it's one that bound up with all of these other interesting questions that we can ask right now. That's another one. And particularly given that there's a new prime minister. Who knows, right? There's some new everything.
A lot of transition in 1 week.
That's a lot of transition.
A lot of transition.
All
right, we did it. We cleared the board, which always.
Woohoo! Okay, so now allow me to say, first of all, thank you for joining us and Newbie the History Bird for a discussion on this Friday morning. Thank you, Annie, for engaging in essentially the conversation of democracy on another Friday morning. It's getting together in groups like this to really consciously, deliberately debate and consider and evaluate where we are and where we hope to be in a group, openly saying what we want to say. That's democracy. So thank you as ever for doing this 127 times. And many of you have been here from the beginning. I salute you folks. I will also say that at this point, typically, again, if there's anyone here who is new, we now will segue to the after party. What that means is that we will no longer be recording our conversation. And what that means is that we will be able to be freer and easier in our conversation with each other. And we can talk about whatever the heck we decide we want to talk about. If you beamed in here through the NCHE website, just stay right where you are and poof, you will be in the after party momentarily. If you are watching on Facebook, you need to leave Facebook and join us through ncheteach.org/conversations. And that will take you directly into the after party, which you don't have to register for or pay for. You will just join us in whatever the heck it is we talk about. Thank you, everybody, for Annie as well. And John is not here, which I did not realize.
Yeah, John's off, so we got Kathleen. So it's an all-girl band.
Thank you. Ooh, thank you, Kathleen, for being here. There you go. Okay, thank you. You need to have
hair day today.
Yeah, actually, mine's just invisible. At any rate, thank you for your helping us actually exist online. And thanks to you guys too. And I will see you, if you're not going to stay for the after party, next week with some maybe before Thursday topic. Maybe based on what we see this week. Okay.
All right.